Welcome everybody to our webinar focused on high school challenges. We are thrilled to have so many of you already signed on. And as I've noticed folks sign on in the very last minute, I'm hoping we'll get a couple more folks participating. So I'm Brandy Simonson, and Heather George and I are going to co-facilitate this webinar. Heather's having a few technical challenges at the moment, so she's not on yet, but she will be on shortly. And we're extremely excited to introduce you, or reintroduce many of you, to Stephanie Martinez and Patty Hirschfeld. I almost used your full name, Patty, who are some of our resident experts in the National PBIS Center on working with high schools. So it's an area that we're all excited to learn more about, and we're thrilled that we have Stephanie and Patty on to share that information with us. So before we turn it over to them, we just wanted to remind you guys of some of the positively stated expectations for our webinar this afternoon. So if you're calling in or on the computer, make sure your end is on mute. I think Ivan is actually able to mute you for parts of this, but during the first part of today, we will have a kind of formal presentation from Patty and Stephanie. After that's over, we'll actually ask everyone to unmute, and Ivan will open it up so we can all participate and have a conversation. If you want to keep track of your comments or questions or ask anything during their presentation, I'll monitor that, and you can use the chat box. But again, you will have a chance to actually talk with folks as soon as we open that up. As you all know, we do show these webinars live on the website, so you can download them after the fact if any of your colleagues missed them and share them later. Just as a heads up, we are going to ask Ivan at the very end if we can have a conversation that he's going to take out of the recording. We'd like to get a little bit of feedback from you guys on just the overall format of the webinars. So we've been structuring the state ones, as you know, kind of with the formal presentation and then more of a PLC feel. So we wanted to kind of have that exchange. And Heather and I were chatting after the last couple about whether it was helpful to do that and have the whole portion of it recorded, or whether we might feel more comfortable if only the presentation was recorded and the conversation was not. So think about that during the webinar today, and we will ask you about that at the very end. All right, so again, just quick expectations. Our job is to try and be as clear as possible. Your job is to try and stay engaged. I know we're all tempted to try and multitask and get 5 million things done at the same time, but we'd like us to be able to have a really productive conversation. So if we could all just try and maintain this focus. I don't believe we have polls today, but we are going to plan the conversation afterwards, and hopefully we'll all learn a lot about high schools and get some of our own specific questions answered. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Patty and Stephanie, and then I will be back after they chat to help facilitate the conversation. So you guys are good to go. Thank you.
So welcome everybody. This is Patty, and I think I'm going to start us out here and talk a little bit about a visual representation as we think about high school implementation of PBIS, and really specifically focusing on some of the differences, some of the nuances that we see in our work as being really essential considerations as we try to implement. So here to the left, there are some factors of high school context that can really influence how the key features are implemented. And the three that we've noticed most in work, and I'm going to use my little pointer here, are size, culture, and developmental level. And I want to talk just a little bit first about size. And when we're talking specifically about size, there are a number of considerations. First, there's a larger number of students and a larger number of faculty and adults in the building. The teaming structures are larger. We have multiple administrators. The campus itself is much larger. We have multiple departments and divisions. We have multiple resources. There's just a lot more to consider as we think about school-wide implementation. In talking about culture, some of the things I'd like you to think about, certainly language and communication, and certainly culture in the way we typically think about it, but also culture in terms of the adults' philosophy about discipline, the adults' philosophy about actually teaching behavior, because we are oftentimes trained just in a pedagogical approach and thinking about teaching content. And there's that constant focus and pressure around the high stakes outcomes in high schools. And I always remind high schools, we sort of work on a deadline. We have 4 years really to get our work done and to help students be, successful. And finally, developmental level, the third contextual influence. We've got a lot of kind of adolescent brain stuff going on. So managing impulses versus helping kids plan. We have huge variability between the developmental level of a freshman versus that of a senior. So I encourage you to think about these contextual influences as you think through implementation. And we've got some key foundational systems, and specifically, we're talking about data and leadership and communication. And we know in high schools, data, we have a huge pool of data sources to draw from. And managing that data, getting access to it, are all considerations that can complicate implementation. And so that's certainly one of the considerations we want you to focus on. There's also leadership to think about. As I mentioned, we oftentimes, or most often in a high school, see administrative teams. And so we have to think about which administrator is represented on the PBIS team, and how can that administrator get the word back to the team, making sure the entire team of administrators understands the mission and understands specifically what's going to be rolled out in the school, and just ensuring that communication piece is in place. And that is the third feature, third system is just the communication, getting the word out and making sure we have conversations about how that's going to happen. As simple as considering, is the email the right format to get the word out? Do we work through departments? Do we work through grade level meetings? And while those might seem pretty straightforward problems to solve, it's imperative that we really specify what that'll look like. So high school's different with implementation, but it's also the same. And we are certain, based on research, that the core features of implementation, the data systems and practices, those need to stay, and we need to adhere to fidelity with that. And so while we certainly have differences, we need to stick to those critical features. And finally, when we think about high school implementation, we have very different outcomes. We have different areas that we focus on. Just as with implementation at all levels, we focus on the social behavioral aspects. In high schools, it's critical to no longer silo academics, but the merge of those two, behavior and academics, is absolutely essential. This is a really big feature with respect to teacher buy-in as well. This one's a little difficult to see, but it's personalization and school engagement. So as we implement school-wide PBIS, some of the emphasis can be and should be focused on getting kids connected to school, so they're better engaged in their educational experience. And we know when kids are engaged, there's a greater likelihood that they'll complete high school. And finally, a special consideration is freshmen. Freshmen are a unique population in and of themselves. There's a lot of data to support this as a very critical and very, very difficult transition for our students. And so a lot of schools will dedicate, in some cases, all of their implementation to freshmen, but certainly customizing some of the supports to make sure freshmen are able to effectively make that transition. I like to think of this visual almost in a diagnostic way. So as you're thinking about your implementation and perhaps you've hit a roadblock, I like to step back and take into account the context and ask yourself, so is it something about the size that's getting in the way? Or is there a culture in terms of culture and the adult philosophy? How can we support some change in that respect? And are we addressing the developmental variance across our students? And the same considerations around data, the leadership, and communication. And finally, the focus areas that I mentioned before are strong contributors to teacher buy-in. So the what's in it for me aspect. And so can we make sure some of the outcomes that we're measuring and sharing are anchored around some of the more high school specific focus areas? Stephanie?
Thanks, Patty. So as Patty was mentioning, there are some core features that are in place for PBIS, and so we really believe that those core features still need to be at the high school, but they're going to look different. And so this is right here, this first slide is just talking about what those things are and how they'll be different at a high school comparative to an elementary or a middle school. So when we think about database problem solving, that database piece, we typically think of talking about office discipline referrals, rates of in-school suspension and out-of-school suspension. But at the high school, there is, as Patty said, a greater emphasis. We have them for 4 years, or we hope that we have them for 4 years. So high schools tend to look at that traditional ODR data, but there's other data sources that they really want to look at as well, focusing around some of that academic piece, graduation, course failures, and I know that's a big thing here in the state of Florida now. Every course has an end-of-course exam, and you have to pass that in order to do it. I think that's just so important, too, because we know that the students need those graduation credits to graduate. So as much as we're focusing on the behavior and social-emotional development, we're also focusing on the early warning systems data and academic data as well. And then thinking about teaming, one of the big elements of PBIS is having a cross-representation of the team, but really even thinking about at a high school level how that will look when you have 9th grade teachers, 10th grade teachers, 11th grade teachers, 12th grade teachers. You've got elective staff. You also have staff members that are maybe teaching AP or IB at your course, and you've got some that are getting the kids just ready for that standardized testing that's more of a remedial. So you've got such a representation there, too. But it's also important at this point, too, is that we get our students involved. And so a lot of times when I start talking to high schools about student involvement, they think it's a great idea, and they naturally jump to the leaders of their school, so they think of student government. So we want to get across to them that we don't want to dismiss the use of students in student government. It's a perfect opportunity, but we also want to think of who are some other leaders on our campus that our students may look up, and that they're a representation of our student body. So not just student government, but maybe our athletes, or our students who are in drama, maybe our students who are at risk for dropping out. So they're representing everybody on our campus. And then thinking about the implementation of elements, and Patty kind of touched on this, that a lot of times when I start working with schools, the thought of doing this school-wide is a little overwhelming, especially at some of our high schools that are larger. We have high schools here in the state of Florida up to 4,000 students, and that's a little overwhelming for them at first. And so a lot of times we can sometimes get that buy-in from school staff, maybe by just starting with freshmen. And then as those students become sophomores, they're used to it, and it kind of moves up that way gradually. Some of our other schools have found some success by just targeting a specific behavior or a specific location. Things like tardy. When we talk to high schools here, one of the biggest issues across all high schools is tardy. And they said, if we could just get tardies under control, or dress code, or technology, so it's not a major severe behavior, but it's a chronic behavior that they want to target first. So starting with one of those behaviors, or even maybe a specific location to target. And so when we talk about that specific location, it's usually not our classrooms, but they're thinking about issues in the hallway, maybe the parking lot, maybe the gym or locker room. So starting with implementing PBS in one of those areas. And this is a big piece too, the stakeholder buy-in. And so I call it stakeholder instead of faculty buy-in here, or staff buy-in, where you might see. I call it stakeholder because it's not just, again, about the adults on campus, but it's about getting the buy-in from our students as well. And so I hear a lot of times from high schools, oh, PBIS, that's that elementary positive reinforcement system thing that they're doing. That's that elementary school thing. So a lot of times we talk to high schools about what is going to be the buy-in for the staff and students. And some of them will say, if you say the terms PBIS, they automatically dismiss it. So some of our most successful high schools don't even call it PBIS. They just say it's our way of work. This is how we're handling behavior and discipline and social emotional development on our campus. I can think of a couple schools in particular that were very successful with their implementation, and they developed everything around their school mascot, because that mascot was the culture of their school. And so one was the wolf, so everything was around the wolves. I have another high school I work with where they have a pirate theme. It was everything around the pirate. Another one was Cowboy Joe, so everything was around Cowboy Joe and built it in that way. So it improved the behavior and discipline, but it was also improving the climate and culture of their school. The other things that we sometimes hear is, okay, that's great. We've seen it work at elementary schools. Show me the data that it's effective at a high school. So if you can find and identify a high school in your state that they can compare to, and this is the other one, I want a high school like me. So if I'm a high school in an urban city of 2,500 students, I don't want to see the data at a rural school of 1,500 students. So they really want to see comparison data from other like schools. And then the other part of it is what Patty was saying earlier about getting the buy-in. We want them to have some say in it. Is it going to work for me? So we always say everything is a draft back to the faculty, staff, and students prior to actually implementing those things in place. So those are how it looks a little bit different at Tier 1. And then the last piece, and this is a hard one too, where it talks about leadership. Most of our high schools tend to have multiple administrators. And typically what we find is there's one administrator who is assigned to PBIS and to be on the PBIS team. Sometimes that person buys into it. Sometimes that's just their assigned duty. But the key here is they're not the only one that deals with behavior and discipline typically on campus. So there gets to be some, maybe sometimes lack of communication between the representative administrator on the PBIS team, and they're not communicating fully back to the whole administrator team with all the other assistant principals and deans of students who deal with discipline. So making sure that everybody on campus who deals with discipline or behavior and handling misbehavior for students is all on the same page, and there's that good flow of communication back and forth so that there's that consistency. So those are the essential features and how they look a little bit different at Tier 1 at high schools. And so now I'm just going to give you some different ways that Tier 2 and Tier 3, those common features look a little bit different at high schools. So the first one is when we think about identifying students who are in need of Tier 2 and Tier 3 supports, one of the big pieces for data first is screening the students. And so a lot of times we at the high schools don't have a set schedule for doing those screenings. I work in Florida, and again, our Florida schools have a set schedule for those screening for academic, especially reading. But there's not that set schedule of when to screen for students who may need Tier 2 and Tier 3 supports. Typically, our schools, when they do that universal screening for students, they look solely at behavioral data. And again, going back to that key piece for academics at a high school and our ultimate goal of getting students to graduate in 4 years on time, it's really important to look at multiple sources of data and including that academic data in there as well. I read an article recently by Kathleen Lane, and it really surprised me that, again, our high school teachers sometimes don't feel as comfortable recommending students for social, emotional, or Tier 2 behavioral support. So providing that support to our staff members as they are referring students for those additional needed supports. And then the other big one that I do see commonly is when we start thinking about interventions specifically at Tier 2, there's not a lot of interventions that have been evidence-based around high school students, and the curriculums that are a lot of times available don't have a built-in progress monitoring tool. So I find a lot of times high schools need that support in identifying a tool that can be used for progress monitoring that's quick and efficient and that will provide the information that's needed. And then once they have that data, what are they going to do to identify if the student needs continued Tier 2 supports, if maybe the Tier 2 supports they're receiving are not being effective, and if they're not being effective, do we need to provide different Tier 2 supports, or do we need to look at possibly providing Tier 3 supports? So actually having the school teams sit down and decide what those decision rules are going to be based on data for their particular students at their school. Which then leads into the implementation of actually evidence-based practices at Tier 2 and Tier 3. I said it earlier, there's not as many evidence-based practices and programs for students for Tier 2 and Tier 3 for high school. I know there are some available, and if you go to What Works Clearinghouse or SAMHSA, that you'll start to identify them a little bit more. But once we have identified those interventions that we're going to use, going back to that approach of Patty mentioned of silos, it's really hard to think about providing those supports because of scheduling at high schools. They have their academics, they need their credits to work towards graduation. So how are we going to fit that into the typical school day? And then besides that, okay, now that we've got it fit in, who's going to provide those Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions and supports? So one of the high schools that I worked with did something called PAUSE, Positive Alternative with Students, and they actually did a modified schedule. So they took what they had a reduced day, and so they took about 5 minutes from every schedule, and once a month they did a reduced day, and that gave them an additional 25 minutes, and each student on that campus was assigned to an adult. And then depending upon the needs of the students, it could have been an enrichment activity, it could have been an academic support, and then the students at that point in time who needed some Tier 2 or Tier 3 supports were paired with a mentor. They met with them during that pause time, and then they had some additional times they met with them. And then all students, as part of that pause, got a half credit of elective. So it was something that they had to get approval from the district and to build into that master schedule. And then the other complicated thing is trying to match the students to the interventions that are being offered at our school. So really understanding function-based and how to match students based on their functional needs or their social skills deficits to appropriate curriculums or interventions that are available. The other thing that we sometimes find here that's a little bit different from elementary and secondary schools is making sure that there is someone on the team with content knowledge around what does MTSS or RTI look for Tier 2 for behavior for students and for Tier 3, and having that content knowledge around those supports so that they can go back and work with classroom teachers, the rest of the faculty to understand the supports that are going to be provided. And they then themselves may be providing those Tier 2 supports and making sure you've got someone with that information. The other big thing that I find a lot of times is when we talk about MTSS and the Tier 3 supports, a lot of times we still, elementary and middle schools have maybe separate teams that are one looking at academics and one looking at behavior, or sometimes we have a PBIS team at the elementary middle school that looks at Tier 1 and then a separate team that looks at services for Tier 2 and Tier 3, was what we're finding at the high schools is that there's typically one team that is looking across students across all 3 tiers, and they're addressing both academics and behavior. So just making sure those supports are in place and there's that, again, strong team doing that. And then the last one is stakeholder buy-in. Again, this is just making sure that the faculty and staff are comfortable with not only providing Tier 2 supports, but they're comfortable in identifying students who might need Tier 2 supports and feeling like that they have the ability to progress monitor. So as a high school science biology teacher, that I have the ability to progress monitor Johnny who's come into my classroom that's getting Tier 2 supports, or maybe Johnny who's got a wraparound plan, and understanding what I need to be doing to support Johnny. So what are the responsibilities for me on that wraparound plan? What skills do I need to reinforce with him and he's in my classroom? So just looking at a piece of paper sometimes and seeing that support that's needed, sometimes I might need someone to go to have that modeling done for me or an explanation done for me. And also making sure that I'm committed to what's on that plan and I feel that it's relevant in my classroom for the student, and getting my buy-in before I'm actually asked to put it in place. So when I taught high school, I actually had a student who had an individualized behavior intervention plan, and one of the things that was frustrating for me as a high school teacher was the person who developed the plan never observed that specific student in my classroom, and then was asking me to implement a plan that was not relevant and did not meet the context or situation of my classroom. So I had a lot of resistance with it. I'm a very compliant person, so I did it the first couple days, but when I quickly saw there was not a good contextual fit, I threw that plan to the side and no longer did it and relied on my own personal skills instead of what was in the plan. So again, making sure that there's the buy-in so that they're implementing what's identified there. The last couple of things are, what are some implications for you as the SEA? And I think some of the biggest things here is when we're training our high schools, letting them know that the training materials that they are receiving has been modified to provide examples and is relevant to high schools. One of the things that I find is that if I have a mixed group, so I have an elementary, middle, and high school together, I make sure to always point out a high school example first. I don't want to turn my teams off by having a lot of elementary school examples, so I really try to balance that piece as well. And then I bring in some supplemental resources and tools for my high schools beyond what the regular training is. And a lot of times I will do that one-on-one with that specific high school because they feel like I'm building that relationship with them. So in order to do that, those modified training materials and resources, I know there's some stuff on the PBIS website, but what I would highly recommend is that you find some model high schools in your own state because, again, high schools in your state are going to hear from each other. So once you've identified those model high schools, learn from them. One of the things that we've done here and are continuing to do is interview some of our high school coaches. And we're learning from them what it takes at a high school, getting more examples so we can continue to provide that training and technical assistance around real-life examples of what they're doing. The other thing that I suggest is looking at the student outcome data or fidelity data that you collect specifically for high schools and identify some of those potential barriers based on the data that's collected. And the graphic that Patty showed earlier is perfect. So when you're looking at that data, go back to the graphic that she showed and identify what are some potential barriers and then put those in place. And then the last one I recommend is that if you are doing any sort of statewide professional development conference, workshop, that you have a specific session just for the high schools. I know that one of the things that the high schools really do appreciate about the PBIS forum every year in Rosemont is that there is a strand specific to high schools. So high schools can hear from one another. So having those specific professional development opportunities, and if at all possible, when you are doing any sort of training, if you can have a training that's just dedicated to secondary schools so that they're not lumped in with those elementary schools. I'm going to turn this back over to Brandy and Heather.
Thank you. And Heather is now on the line. We're excited to have her join us. And so she and I are going to work together to co-facilitate, but we are so thankful for the presentation that Patty and Stephanie gave, and we're also even more thankful that they're going to stay on to actually answer your questions. So we get to be kind of the facilitators and they can be a resident experts. So what we would like to do is now turn it over to you all. So Ivan's going to open up the kind of line so you guys can all participate. If any of you have muted things on your own end, unmute when you're willing or interested in contributing. If you're not chatting, maybe just privately mute your own line so we don't get all the background noise. And I think some of the things that we wanted to start out with is questions, but again, this is your turn. Think about things that you're already doing to support your district. Think about barriers. Think about anything you might have already developed that you'd be happy to share with the group. So with that, I'm going to be quiet and let you guys answer or ask questions. And if for some reason anyone isn't comfortable asking live, you can also type into the chat window. And I'm happy to say your questions for you.
Brandy?
Yes.
Hi, this is Linda from Delaware, DOE and Delaware PBS. How are you doing? So of all the, Debbie and Sarah are not able to be on today, and I probably am the least qualified to talk about the high school implementation, but I do know that we had some success with high schools when they engaged student leaders, and the students were partners with the team members, and particularly at the school-wide implementation, in guiding efforts, because the buy-in from the students helped to strengthen the buy-in from the staff, And what we have done also is, as was suggested, to not call it anything with a P, a B, an I, or an S. And, we focused on multi-tiered systems of support, calling it that, and then anything that was already being implemented at the high school level, if we were able to help the teams show how they could integrate their efforts and just, kind of ride along with something that was already accepted and focused on that with school climate. And we also have a secondary forum each year where we bring together middle and high schools, and usually one of the schools hosts, and the host school typically has some type of presentation where they share an implementation that has been met with success and they have data to support it. And that has actually done very well. We're a very small state, Delaware, but we typically can have anywhere from 30 to 50 people that would participate in that, and which doesn't seem like a lot, but my director loves it because it's typically hard to get secondary people engaged. And we've also had an administrators roundtable so that during a training or PD session, there would be specific issues that the administrators would have, and they would be able to network, and we would again have some type of either knowledge or skill building presentation initially, and then they would follow up with some networking and share information. So they were just some things that have helped us, but because we absolutely struggle at the high school level more than middle.
This is Patty. I really wanted to emphasize what you said about youth voice involving students, and I think you're absolutely right. And perhaps because of the developmental age and the maturity of our students in high school, they're able to carry a heavier lift. And we've had schools certainly use students within the building, for instance, to teach the behavior lessons, serve in some capacity on the team. But we've had students also at the district level. So high schools are sending almost like a student council kind of model. They're electing different students to serve on a district level PBIS team to capture some of that youth voice. And we also see a lot of times students speaking at board meetings to talk about the effort to really leverage some support in that way. So students are a critical part at the high school.
Stephanie or Patty, this is Heather. Ashley Greenwald in Nevada has posted a really good question in the chat box, and I know for sure in Florida we've got high schools of over 3,000 students, so this is an issue that we've had. But I'm wondering if you guys could talk about, what do you do if you've got a large high school that doesn't allow you to use a third-party data collection system like SWIFT, but data collection is pretty cumbersome when you've got over 3,000 students, and what kinds of things have you seen have been successful in schools that you've worked with?
Stephanie, did you want to?
Heather.
Sorry.
Ashley, so I have had some in that same situation. They entered their data into their district-wide system that was required to collect that office discipline referrals. They then worked with their district system to figure out how the data could be either downloaded into Excel or could be graphed for them. And so one school in particular really worked well with the district MIS person and said, this is what we want, this is the information we need. And that person would work with them and actually generated some Swiss kind of like reports so that they would have that over time. This other school also had some growth over time, so when they looked at total number of ODRs, they started doing it per 100, which is something our project has recommended, because they had such growth over time that they felt a little discouraged at one point because they went from like 1,500 students one year to about 4,500 within a 3-year time period, and it looked like there was huge increases of referrals, but when they broke it down per 100 students, that took into account that increase. That school also in particular had a school psychologist who was a support staff to the school who was really into the data piece of it, so she took that on as a responsibility, and once a month she would download the data in Excel and she would do some sorting of it graph it, and then send it back to the faculty and staff because the data was already into the system. This school also looked and cross-referenced some of their behavioral data with their academic data. So they started looking at like course failures, GPAs, and they used that information to start looking at their Tier 2 and Tier 3 for their students.
That was great. I see Ashley's typing, so she might have a follow-up question, so we'll come back to that. Other questions or thoughts from you guys? I'm missing one from Iris that's saying that in Montana she wanted to share that they also hold a high school forum and they focus on professional development for secondary school. They hold regional youth days to engage middle and high school students. So Patty, kind of the youth voice piece you were emphasizing from Linda's comment, it sounds like that's a pretty good theme. And Ashley's commenting back that they've done and attempted similar things in Nevada, but they've had a challenge collecting information or data on minor behaviors. So something that in the past wouldn't have been entered is something that they're having a hard time asking teachers to start tracking. Thoughts about that? Do you guys have schools that are tracking minors?
Brandy, this is Patty. I just actually asked, kind of requested those data from those high schools that are using SWIFT, and on average, I guess it was 2 years ago, about 65% of high schools were using minors, and this past, the most recent data indicated there were about 75%. So there's a slight rise, but you know, it's not as high as in the elementary schools. It's definitely much more difficult to manage, but we're getting there.
That's great.
I'll just say, and here in Florida, I've had a few that have really done the minors. They said that it kind of scares them off, and that they really want to get a good understanding of their Tier 1 data and a Tier 1 system in place before they even attempt to do the collecting of the minors.
There's a caution, too, that we should think about with respect to minors. And in training, you know, I'll sometimes hear schools say that, well, once I reach 3 minors, that counts as a major quantitatively or qualitatively, and so therefore that becomes an office discipline referral. And I think the mindset and the shift that we want to promote is that multiple minors for the same behavior should really kind of trigger us to ask, you know, what additional support might this student do, kind of thinking maybe functionally about what's the trigger, what's causing the behavior. And so that's kind of one cautionary statement about using minors. And as trainers, that's a really important message to communicate.
I think that's really helpful. I think it's always good to have schools think about why they're collecting their data and how they're going to use it for decision making, and always tying it back to the kind of critical features and the big picture function as well is fantastic. Other questions or successes that you guys would like to share across other states or folks who have already contributed? The one question I've had as I was listening to you guys present, and I think about what's also unique about high school, is that focus on college and career readiness. And I know my colleagues at UConn, Jen Freeman and others, have started to think about how kind of to link the PBIS efforts and other MTSS efforts into the college and career readiness piece. Have you guys thought any about that and kind of what that might look like?
It's funny that you asked that, Brandy, because I was just having a conversation with something about this recently. And thinking about with PBIS, one of the big things is the teaching of the social skills that will be needed for long life skills. And so doing some research recently and reading up on companies for in college graduates is some of those social skills and assume students who are college and career ready already have. And so sometimes there's a, well, our students who are going to college or careers may not need some of that stuff, that they're already getting it. And so thinking about how to build that piece in with that social emotional development of what are those skills that our students need to be ready when they leave here for employment or for college. So building that part in with a Tier 1 system of making sure that our kids have those skills. And so some of them are like leadership, problem solving, cooperation and collaboration. So just making sure our kids have those skills, because sometimes there may be the assumption that the certain students may not need those, that they naturally have them.
I've also seen a few of the schools in Oregon, sorry, this is Patty, who are using freshman advisory to integrate some of that college and career readiness skills development. And much like Stephanie shared, they're differentiating. So they're spending the first quarter where all students are getting the same instruction, which includes some of those transition, those skills that are important to transition to high school, study skills or academic behaviors, but also focusing on some of the social skills. And then after first quarter, there's kind of a reevaluation of which students continue to need that support, and then which students have kind of indicated through their academic performance that they're kind of ready to fly without that, and so they differentiate in that way. And I think that's a really great model. It certainly requires a little bit of time to evaluate, who's on track and who might need additional support at that point in time, but that investment in freshmen has a huge payoff. So.
Patty, that's a really good idea. I spent some time at the high school a couple of years back, and one of the running jokes, we did a focus group with students who were their second year of high school but weren't considered sophomores because they didn't have the credits necessary to become a sophomore. So they called themselves freshmore, and they said they were halfway between the two, and after talking to them about what they needed when they had started as freshmen is exactly what you described. They said if we had some of those things when we first came in, those supports, then we think we would have completely understood what was needed for us to become sophomores and what high school's like. They said that transition from middle school was really, really hard. And so going back to what I said earlier about that pause system that the one high school did, seeing more and more schools are doing exactly what Patty described, but then gets the scheduling aspect of it. And so if there's a way to build in a course like that where the kids get half credit or some sort of credit to motivate them, motivate the staff to do it. I've also seen some schools where they do like a summer program where the freshmen are invited to come out for like a week or two prior to the start of school. It's run by some upperclassmen with some other teachers. And they go over what the expectations are for the high school. They go over some of those social skills, lockers, all the things that I think sometimes we assume kids will get from somewhere else. So these are the different clubs. These are the different sports. This is what the GPA requirement is. This is all these different resources that are available, but also building in some of that social emotional development and introducing it there and then continuing it throughout the school year as Patty described.
That's really helpful. Thank you guys for commenting on that. So from the rest of you, are there other things that you have done that have been really successful in supporting your LEAs or supporting your schools? Or on the flip side, it sounds like we've already talked a little bit about data and ways to make things relevant and ways to avoid kind of labeling things in ways that are going to turn schools off from the beginning. So in addition to maybe kind of using PBIS or some of the traditional barriers that we've already discussed, have you guys encountered other barriers to working and supporting with and supporting high schools?
Stephanie and Patty, this is Heather. I had a question for you in regards to training, and I think for state projects, when we're trying to meet the needs of districts, oftentimes they want to throw all of their schools at us to get everybody trained at once. And I wanted to know what you found in your experience in terms of mixing high schools with the elementary and middle schools, or if you think it's best that they are separate, and if they need to be separate or if they're together, how do you adjust the training to meet their needs?
Stephanie spoke to that earlier, and I think we both agree that if it's at all possible logistically that high schools be trained independent of the elementary schools, and absolutely making sure the curriculum you're using to train reflects high school examples. And we integrate a lot of the conversations around that first slide, that visual representation of the context considerations, trying to incorporate some of those into the training curriculum as well. So we help high schools see, again, that implementation is very different, and yet it's still the same with respect to the critical features.
I know that sometimes, even though we suggest doing them separate, it's not possible. One of the things that I make sure of is that we have video examples. So I make sure to show some video examples of high schools. I also show them where they can use those same video examples. We in Florida have a YouTube page, and it has high school video examples on there, so I make sure to point that out. Then one of the things that I did several years ago was I compiled, based on the 10 elements around the benchmarks of quality, different high school examples, and that we have them on the PBS website. So I always make it a point when I'm with the high schools to show them where to find that, because those are examples relevant just to high schools. And they give me feedback. They really appreciate it, because there's something like 60 different lesson plans that I've got posted there. I've got different ideas for rewarding staff and students. And so I go there and I show it to them. And so even if we have a mixed group, I purposely make it a point to walk up to the schools when the teams are working and to provide them some additional resources. I say, these are specific to high school only. Let me give you some different things. And so building that in to know that, okay, there are some examples. And so that's why I said really collecting those examples are really, really helpful to have at your fingertips to provide to the schools during the training, and then showing them where they can find some of those examples after the training that they can refer back, whether to the entire faculty or for additional team members that were not at the training.
I'll also kind of give you some heads up. Stephanie and I are part of a national work group, and we're working on a high school specific curriculum, not an entire training, but sort of supplemental components. So when we think about leadership, these are some training slides that you could pull and insert into the training curriculum you're currently using that speak more specifically to high school implementation. They'll eventually be on the pbis.org website. But they're still in development, so you might want to look for that in the future.
Patty, that's great, and thanks for both of you for explaining that. I'm wondering then, which makes perfect sense to pull the high schools in a separate training, or at least make sure that there's high school examples. Have you run into any issues if they, depending on a district, if they're categorizing it, we've got elementary versus secondary, and they want to pull their junior highs or their middle schools with the high schools? Have you found there to be any issues with that, or if that was a way to separate the two from the elementary folks, that works better?
It's funny, Heather, that you asked it, because I have found at least my middle schools really appreciate going with the high schools, because a lot of times they say we get lumped with elementary school and we see ourselves more like high school because of the way we're structured and we're set up. And so it's really funny that I know that the middle schools really appreciate being lumped with the high schools a lot of the times. And I don't think the high schools have a negative reaction so much at the middle schools as they do with the elementary schools.
So I have kind of a detailed follow-up question. Certainly if anyone else who's listening has a question they want to jump in with, feel free. You guys, I thought, had a really good recommendation around kind of how to get things off the ground by focusing on maybe rolling out in one grade or rolling out in one setting. And I've certainly worked with high schools who've chosen to approach it that way. What I've struggled a little bit with is how to support them in then scaling up from there. I think one of the high schools I'm thinking of in particular rolled out pretty strong in the 9th grade, but somehow that message then got communicated to their larger staff that it was the 9th grade's initiative. And so when they looked to grow it up the next year, they were planning on kind of following a cohort of students to grow implementation in the high school. When they looked to extend it up, they were met with a new set of resistance. And so I'm thinking we could have been more proactive in planning for that, but I'm wondering what you guys have done to support those schools who are choosing to focus on one grade or one location kind of from the beginning to have the school-wide vision.
I'll let Stephanie speak to the one location. I haven't worked with schools that have done that, but the schools that I have seen start with freshmen, it has been, my experience has been the students that kind of carry it forward. And so often you have it's not pure teachers teach only freshmen. So getting peer involvement, peer meaning teacher to teacher, can sometimes have a louder voice than trying to just make the statement that we're going with implementation and moving it up. So we've had teachers sort of recruit peers to come to meetings, to get involved in that way, to serve on a committee that feeds the PBIS effort and trying to go in that direction, peer to peer. I should also mention we have schools that just use PBIS with freshmen, and they don't scale it up beyond that.
To piggyback off the grade level one that Patty, when I had one school who was doing it, what they purposely did is they started with a freshman class, but they still brought to the training teachers from 10th, 11th, and 12th grade so that they understood that it would be scaling up over the next couple of years and got their input about how to then roll it out the next year with the plan that at the end of that first year of implementation that the team would come back together and systematically plan how to roll it out the next year. And then kind of a similar thing by location. So at the end of that first year, if they were targeting, let's just say the hallways, the team met back at the end of the year. They did a data analysis to see how PBIS is having an impact on the hallways. And then the team then identified a second setting that they wanted to focus in on the next year. I also had another team talk about how they didn't identify a second setting, but then they talked about, look how successful it was in this one specific setting. Now we want to roll it out to every setting on campus. So those were just some different ways that they kind of scaled it up. And just like Patty said, I've seen some schools say that they want to start with their freshman year and pretty much keep it with their freshmen because they are housed in and such freshmen are really their own little mini campus school.
It's really helpful. Thank you. Do other folks have questions, challenges?
I was going to ask Brandy and Heather, the groups that are here today, do you guys have some model high schools you can use to highlight PBIS in your state with other schools?
Yes, Stephanie, this is Heather. I think that's a great question. And one of the things, like I can see for people who've logged in, we've got an idea of where some of them are, but there's a lot of folks that have logged in using their phone numbers. And so I'm wondering if you guys do have access to your chat box, if you can at least type in your name and which state you're from. That might give an indication, kind of a better idea of where, at least for our presenters, where all of you are from. Stephanie, I don't know if that answered your question.
I was just wondering, because I know we've in the state of Florida have identified what we call some model high schools. So when another high school is interested in coming on board, but they're unsure, will this work? We're not so sure. How can we sell this to our staff? We can sometimes then make those linkages between the two schools, the one that's the model school and the one that's interested. So I was just wondering if any of the states that we're talking to have a process or have identified some model PBIS high schools that they can use to recruit and answer questions for other high schools.
And if you guys would like to respond instead of having to talk, you can use the little hand raise function at the top of your screen. So you can raise your hand if you've identified model high school. You can also use the chat window.
Randy and Heather, this is Patty. While we're waiting to hear from our participants, I wanted to kind of plug a session that we're going to be hosting at APBS. There will be a workshop on Saturday that is specifically for secondary administrators and implementers, and we'll have some content certainly to go over. But it's really a great networking opportunity and to share, what's going well, what are some common challenges. And so I just kind of wanted to plug that opportunity.
That's fantastic. Do any of the rest of you guys have any further questions, comments, things to share? Seeing a comment from Iris about Montana, and they've already have a couple large high schools who are doing great work. But because the state is so large, it's hard to find ways to connect people. I'm guessing a road trip is a little bit hard to bring a school team on. So that would actually be a great thing to think about if you guys have had good successes, because I know Stephanie, Florida is not exactly tiny. Have you guys used remote ways to share information? I know I've hooked schools up over Skype when they've had a hard time actually getting to each other.
We did something a couple of years ago, and we're contemplating doing something similar again, is that we do these what we call monthly chats that are available and access to anybody, and then we record them and post them. So we've actually had some high schools in the past be our guest speaker that month, and they talk about their implementation. And so schools can log in from anywhere. They can participate live, hear the information live. If it doesn't work for them live, we record it and then we post it, and so they can go back and watch that recording. They can look at the resources and tools that the school has provided as another way of doing that too. Which sounds like is very similar to the GoToMeetings that you're talking about, Iris. But having that has been very helpful as a way to share some resources between schools.
That's fantastic. Do any of you guys have written products or other products that you've collected over the years that have really helped you in supporting districts or local schools with high school? I see that Linda is typing, so thank you, Linda. We'll pause for just a minute to get a couple of other pieces of input. And Linda was saying she'll check. I think depending on your role, those of you guys on the call, some of you may have all of these things and be completely aware, but other folks might want to go back to others. But if you find resources that you have found helpful in your state, those would be things that we could post either on the National PBIS website, so let us know that if you share a resource with us, or that we could at least send around to the other state coordinators who participate on this call. So either way of sharing, I think, would be fantastic. All right, hearing no further things to share or ask, I think that we would like to transition a little bit from this conversation from the recorded portion of the webinar. So we'll say thank you very much to those of you guys who have participated today.